Have you ever felt like you're constantly losing? Not in any specific game, but in the game of life itself. You scroll through social media and see someone your age who just bought their third property. You go to a high school reunion and discover that guy who barely passed is now running a successful startup. You look at your colleague who got promoted while you're still in the same position, and every single time, the same question burns in your mind. What's wrong with me? Let me tell you something that might hurt at first, but will set you free. Nothing is wrong with you. The problem is that you're measuring your spring by someone else's summer. You're comparing your chapter 3 to their chapter 20. You're running a race that was never meant for you. In Japan, there's a concept so profound that when you truly understand it, your entire relationship with yourself changes forever. They call it Oubaitori, 4 trees, the cherry, the plum, the peach, and the apricot. Each one blooms at a different time, each one blooms in a different way, and each one is perfect in its own season. The cherry doesn't look at the plum and think it's failing because it blooms later. The peach doesn't compare its blossoms to the apricots and feel inferior. Each tree follows its own nature, its own timeline, its own path to becoming exactly what it was meant to be. But somewhere along the way we forgot this truth. We started believing that there's one timeline for success, one path to happiness, one definition of a life well lived, and that lie is destroying us from the inside. Before we dive deep into this story, I want to ask you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and comment below with one area where you constantly compare yourself to others. Career, relationships, body, money. Write it down. Sometimes just naming the demon takes away half its power. Thank you for being here. Let's continue. Marcus Chen was 28 years old when he realized he had been living someone else's life for the past decade. Not literally. He wasn't possessed or under some spell. But in a way that's even more insidious, he had spent 10 years chasing goals that were never his own. Marcus grew up in an immigrant family. His parents came to America with nothing but 2 suitcases and a dream that their children would have the opportunities they never had. And like many children of immigrants, Marcus internalized one unspoken rule. You don't get to waste the sacrifice. You don't get to fail. You don't get to be ordinary. So Marcus did what was expected. He got straight A's. He went to a good university. He majored in something practical, engineering, even though his heart wanted to study philosophy. He got a job at a prestigious tech company. He climbed the ladder. He checked every single box on the list of what success was supposed to look like. From the outside, Marcus had made it. 6-figure salary at 28. Beautiful apartment in the city. Car that made his high school friends jealous. His parents were proud. His relatives bragged about him at family gatherings. Everyone agreed Marcus Chen was a success story, except Marcus. Because every single morning when the alarm went off at 6:30, Marcus felt a weight in his chest that had been getting heavier for years. He'd lie there staring at the ceiling, and the first thought that came to mind wasn't excitement about the day ahead. It was a question. Is this it? Is this what I worked so hard for? Marcus had a colleague named David who was 2 years younger but already a senior engineer. Every time David got recognized in a meeting, Marcus felt something twist inside him. He told himself it was motivation, but late at night, he knew it was envy. He had a friend from college named Sarah who had quit her corporate job to start a non-profit. She made 1/3 of what Marcus made. She lived in a tiny studio apartment. She didn't own a car, but every time Marcus saw her, she had this light in her eyes that he hadn't seen in his own reflection for years. And the worst part? Marcus had a younger brother named Leo who dropped out of college to pursue music. The family had practically disowned him. Marcus had been one of the people telling Leo he was making a huge mistake, throwing his life away, being irresponsible. 3 years later, Leo's band was touring nationally. Not famous, not rich, but making enough to live on. And when Leo came home for Christmas, he had something Marcus desperately wanted and couldn't name. He had peace, he had purpose, he had the certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That Christmas dinner was when everything started to crack for Marcus. He sat there at the table, listening to his parents brag about his salary, watching Leo's quiet smile as people asked about his music, feeling the enormous gap between who everyone thought he was and who he actually was. After dinner, Leo found Marcus alone on the back porch. They hadn't really talked in years, too much resentment on both sides. But that night, Leo sat down next to him and said something that would change Marcus's life forever. You know what I realised after I left school? That I was never actually failing. I was just blooming on a different schedule than everyone expected, and the moment I accepted that, everything changed. Marcus wanted to dismiss it as some hippie philosophy, but he couldn't, because he saw the proof sitting right next to him. His supposedly irresponsible younger brother had found something Marcus was still desperately searching for, a life that felt true. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed thinking about cherry trees and plum trees, and the absurdity of a cherry tree trying to bloom like a plum. And for the first time in years, he asked himself a question he'd been too afraid to consider. What if I've been trying to bloom in someone else's season? 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself sitting in a small office, across from a therapist named Dr. Helen Watanabe. He had never been to therapy before. In his family, therapy was for people who were broken, weak, unable to handle life on their own. But Marcus was desperate enough to break that rule. Dr. Watanabe was a second-generation Japanese-American woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a calm presence that immediately put Marcus at ease. After he spent 20 minutes explaining his situation, his confusion, his sense of falling behind despite having succeeded at everything, she smiled and nodded. What you're describing has a name. In Japanese we call it taijin kyofusho, the fear of how you appear to others, but what you need is the opposite medicine. You need Oubaitori. She wrote the kanji characters on a piece of paper, 4 characters, 4 trees. Oubaitori is a concept that comes from an old Chinese poem, but it's deeply embedded in Japanese philosophy. The cherry blossom, the plum blossom, the peach blossom, and the apricot blossom. Each one is beautiful. Each one is perfect, but each one blooms at a completely different time. Dr. Watanabe leaned forward. The cherry tree doesn't envy the plum tree for blooming earlier. The peach tree doesn't feel like a failure because the apricot's blossoms are a different colour. Each tree simply becomes what it's meant to become, on its own timeline, in its own way. Marcus sat there processing this. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but there was something about the metaphor that reached past his intellectual defences and touched something deeper. So you're saying I shouldn't compare myself to others? Dr. Watanabe shook her head gently. I'm saying comparison isn't the problem. The problem is measuring your spring by someone else's summer. You're 28. Some people your age are already married with children. Some are still in school. Some are travelling the world. Some are building companies. Some are finding themselves. And every single one of those paths is valid. But I feel like I'm behind. Behind what? Behind an imaginary finish line that society drew? Marcus, the race you think you're running doesn't exist. There's no cosmic scoreboard comparing you to everyone else your age. There's only your life, your timeline, your blooming season. Something broke open in Marcus at that moment, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Or like a crack in a dam that's been holding back water for years. He didn't cry, but he felt something that had been tight in his chest for as long as he could remember begin to loosen. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Watanabe gave Marcus a practice. Every time he felt the familiar sting of comparison, every time he saw someone succeeding in a way he wasn't, every time he felt that toxic voice saying you should be further along, he was to do 3 things. First, acknowledge the feeling without judgment. I'm feeling envious. I'm feeling behind. I'm feeling inadequate. No shame, no trying to push it away, just recognition. Second, reality test. Is this person actually ahead of me, or are they just on a different path? Is there actually one correct timeline for human development, or is that a story I've been told? Third, return to his own tree. What season am I in right now? What's blooming in my life that I've been too busy comparing to notice? The first time Marcus tried this practice, he was scrolling through LinkedIn and saw that David, his younger colleague, had just been promoted to lead engineer. The old pattern kicked in immediately. That should be me. I've been here longer. What's wrong with me that he got promoted first? But then Marcus stopped. He put down his phone. He acknowledged. I'm feeling jealous. I'm feeling like I'm falling behind. He reality tested. Is David actually ahead of me? Or is he just excelling at something his particular skills are suited for? Does getting promoted at 26 instead of 28 actually mean he's living a better life? Or does it just mean he's on a different path? And then Marcus returned to his own tree. What's blooming in my life right now? He'd been volunteering at a local community centre teaching kids to code. He'd rekindled his friendship with his college roommate. He'd started reading philosophy again, something he'd abandoned years ago because it wasn't practical. None of these things looked impressive on LinkedIn. None of them would make his parents brag at family dinners, but they were real. They were his. They were the blossoms of his particular tree in his particular season. And slowly, over weeks and months, something fundamental shifted in Marcus. He didn't suddenly stop caring what others thought. He didn't become some enlightened being floating above human concerns, but the grip of comparison started to loosen. A Stanford University researcher who's been studying social comparison for 20 years discovered something remarkable. The human brain is wired to compare. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Our ancestors needed to know where they stood in the tribe for survival. But in the modern world, we're comparing ourselves to thousands of people through social media, creating a comparison overload that our brains weren't designed to handle. The answer isn't to stop comparing completely. The answer is to change what we compare and why. When you compare to learn, to be inspired, to understand different paths, comparison can be healthy. When you compare to judge yourself, to feel superior or inferior, to determine your worth, comparison becomes poison. 6 months into his practice, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He took a 50% pay cut to join Sarah's nonprofit as their technology director. His parents were devastated. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. Even his therapist asked if he was sure, not because she disagreed, but because she wanted him to be certain this was his choice, not a reaction. Marcus had never been more sure of anything. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't making a decision based on what looked impressive or what other people would think. He was following what Dr. Watanabe called his internal compass, the quiet voice that knows what's true for you, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. The first month at the nonprofit was terrifying. Marcus went from a sleek office with free food and ping-pong tables to a cramped space with outdated computers and a coffee maker that only worked half the time. His paycheck was barely enough to cover rent. His lifestyle contracted dramatically, but something else expanded. Every morning when the alarm went off, Marcus didn't feel that weight in his chest anymore. He felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Anticipation, curiosity about the day ahead, a sense that what he was doing mattered in a way that writing code for a tech giant never had. The non-profit worked with underprivileged kids in the city, teaching them technology skills and providing mentorship. Marcus found himself working directly with teenagers who reminded him of his younger self, smart, capable, but told by the world that there was only one path to success. One kid in particular, a 15-year-old named Jerome, became close with Marcus. Jerome was brilliant with computers, but failing most of his classes because he couldn't see the point. He didn't want to go to college. He wanted to start his own tech business. His teachers told him he was delusional. His counselor said he needed to be realistic. Marcus saw himself in Jerome, the part of himself that had wanted to study philosophy, but chose engineering because it was practical, the part that had spent 10 years being realistic and responsible and miserable. One afternoon, Jerome asked Marcus a question that stopped him cold. "Mr. Chen, did you always know you wanted to do this?" Marcus could have lied, could have made it sound like he'd always been on this noble path, but he didn't. He told Jerome everything. About spending 10 years climbing the wrong ladder, about comparing himself to everyone and feeling like he was losing, about his brother who dropped out and found peace, about Oubaitori and the 4 trees that bloom differently. Jerome listened carefully. Then he said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "So you're saying, it's okay that I'm not like the other kids?" "Not just okay," Marcus said. "That's the whole point. You're not supposed to be like the other kids. You're supposed to be like you." But Jerome looked uncertain. "But what if I fail? What if I try to do my own thing and it doesn't work?" Marcus thought about this for a moment. Then he asked, "What if you spend your whole life trying to bloom like a cherry tree when you're actually a plum tree? What if you get really good at being something you're not and wake up at 40 realizing you have no idea who you actually are?" Jerome didn't have an answer for that, but Marcus could see something shift behind his eyes. The same thing that had shifted in Marcus's eyes a year ago. Permission. Permission to be exactly who you are. A Yale University psychologist who's been studying authenticity for 15 years explains that most people spend their entire lives performing a version of themselves they think the world wants to see. They make decisions based on external expectations rather than internal truth. And the result is what she calls the authenticity gap, the painful distance between who you are and who you're pretending to be. The people who report the highest levels of life satisfaction aren't the richest or the most successful by traditional measures. They're the people with the smallest authenticity gap. The people who have figured out how to be themselves in a world that's constantly telling them to be someone else. Marcus had been living with a massive authenticity gap for 10 years, and the process of closing that gap, of learning to bloom in his own season, was simultaneously the hardest and most liberating thing he'd ever done. But here's what nobody tells you about the path to authenticity. It gets worse before it gets better. Because when you stop performing, when you stop living for external validation, you have to face something terrifying, your own expectations of yourself. Marcus discovered this one night about 8 months into his new job. He was lying in bed, and instead of feeling proud of the choice he'd made, he felt crushing doubt. What if this was a mistake? What if he'd thrown away his career for nothing? What if in 5 years he looked back and realised he'd been an idiot? The comparison voice was back, but this time it wasn't comparing him to his colleagues. It was comparing him to an imaginary version of himself who had stayed at the tech company, gotten promoted, bought a house, checked all the traditional boxes. Marcus had learned enough by now to recognise what was happening. This wasn't reality speaking, this was fear. Fear of having made the wrong choice. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of not being enough. He texted Dr. Watanabe even though it was late. "I'm spiralling. Can we talk?" She called him within 10 minutes. "Marcus, do you remember what I told you about Oubaitori? The 4 trees that bloom differently. Right. But do you remember what I didn't tell you? What the concept doesn't say?" Marcus thought. "I don't know. It doesn't say that one tree's blossom is better than another's. It doesn't say that blooming early is good and blooming late is bad. It doesn't say anything about success or failure. It only says that each tree blooms in its own time, in its own way, and that this is natural, this is correct, this is how it should be." Marcus felt tears starting. "But what if my way is wrong?" Dr. Watanabe's voice was gentle but firm. "Marcus, there is no wrong season to bloom. There's only your season, and you're in it right now. The cherry tree doesn't apologise for not being a plum. The peach tree doesn't second-guess its blossoms. They simply bloom when it's their time, and right now, it's your time." Something settled in Marcus after that conversation. Not permanently. He would have moments of doubt many more times, but he had touched something true, a certainty that went deeper than fear or comparison or the voices of expectation. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, not because this path was objectively better than any other path, but because it was his path, his blooming season, his particular way of unfolding. 1 year after joining the non-profit, something unexpected happened. The organisation received a large grant and Marcus was promoted to Chief Technology Officer. His salary still wasn't what it had been at the tech company, but it was enough to live comfortably. More importantly, he was building something he believed in with people he respected. But the real transformation wasn't in the external circumstances, it was internal. Marcus had developed what Dr. Watanabe called internal validation, the ability to know your own worth independent of external measures. He no longer needed the promotion, the salary, the title to feel like he was succeeding. He had his own definition of success, and it was much quieter and much deeper than anything that would show up on LinkedIn. Jerome, the 15-year-old Marcus had mentored, ended up starting his own small tech business at 17 with Marcus's help. It wasn't a huge success, but it was real. And more importantly, Jerome was blooming in his own way, on his own timeline, with someone who understood that not everyone needs to follow the traditional path. Marcus's relationship with his family slowly healed. His parents never fully understood his choice, but they saw that he was happy in a way he hadn't been before. And eventually, his mother said something that brought tears to his eyes. "I wanted you to be successful, but I think I forgot to want you to be happy. I'm sorry." His brother Leo became one of his closest friends. They had both walked away from expectations in different ways, and that shared experience created a bond that transcended their old rivalry and resentment. 2 years into his journey of Oubaitori, Marcus was invited to give a talk at his old university. The Career Services Office wanted him to speak to students about non-traditional paths. Marcus almost declined. Who was he to give advice? He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he was just a guy who'd figured some things out the hard way. But he accepted. And on a Thursday evening, he stood in front of 100 college students who looked exactly like he had 10 years ago, hungry for success, terrified of failure, desperate to know what the right path was. Marcus didn't give them a formula. He didn't tell them what to study or what career to pursue. Instead, he told them about 4 trees: the cherry, the plum, the peach, and the apricot, and how each one blooms perfectly in its own season. He told them about spending 10 years climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall, about his brother who found peace by dropping out, about the crushing weight of comparison and the liberation of accepting your own timeline, and then he told them something that made several students start crying. The race you think you're running doesn't exist. There's no cosmic scoreboard. There's no deadline by which you have to have it all figured out. There's only your life and your unique path and your particular way of blooming, and the moment you accept that, truly accept it, everything changes. After the talk, a young woman approached him. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She told Marcus she was a senior, about to graduate with a degree in business, even though what she really wanted to do was art. But art wasn't practical. Art didn't have a clear career path. Art was for people who could afford to fail. Marcus looked at her and saw himself at 22. He saw all the years of living for other people's expectations ahead of her if she didn't change course now. And he said something his therapist had once said to him. What if you're not a cherry tree trying to bloom like a plum? What if you're an artist trying to bloom like a business person, and every day you spend pretending to be something you're not is a day you're not becoming what you actually are? The young woman started crying, not sad tears, released tears. The tears of someone who's been given permission to stop running a race that was never theirs. 3 years after starting his journey with Oubaitori, Marcus had built something he never expected. Not wealth or fame or traditional success, but a life that felt true. A life where the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be had shrunk to almost nothing. A life where he could look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. He still had moments of comparison, still saw friends buying houses and getting married and climbing corporate ladders, still occasionally wondered if he'd made the right choices. But those moments were brief now, because Marcus had developed something more powerful than confidence. He had developed self-trust. The deep knowing that he was on his own path, in his own season, blooming in his own way. A Harvard University researcher who has been studying human development for 30 years explains that most people go through life following scripts written by others. Parents, society, culture, tradition. These scripts aren't necessarily wrong, but they're not necessarily right for everyone either. The people who live the most fulfilled lives are those who learn to write their own scripts, to author their own lives, to bloom on their own terms. This doesn't mean rejecting all external guidance. It means developing the discernment to know which external voices are pointing you toward your truth and which are pulling you away from it. It means learning to hear your own voice underneath all the noise. Marcus had learned to hear his voice, and it had told him to leave the prestigious job, to take the pay cut, to work with kids who reminded him why technology mattered in the first place, to close the gap between the life he was living and the life he was meant to live. But the most profound thing Marcus learned through Oubaitori wasn't about career or money or success. It was something deeper, a truth that changed his entire relationship with being human. You're not behind, you're not ahead, you're exactly where you are, and where you are is exactly where you need to be to become who you're meant to become. This sounds like a platitude until you really understand it, until you feel it in your bones. The cherry tree in February doesn't look at the plum tree that bloomed in January and think it's failing. It simply waits, it gathers energy, it prepares, and when March comes, when its season arrives, it blooms explosively and perfectly and without apology. Marcus was a March bloomer in a world that celebrates January bloomers, and for 10 years he thought something was wrong with him. But nothing was wrong, he was just waiting for his season. On a random Tuesday afternoon, 4 years after his transformation began, Marcus sat in his small office at the non-profit and felt something he'd never felt before. Complete peace with his choices, not confidence that he'd made the right decisions, not certainty that this was the best path, just deep, quiet peace with the life he had built. His phone buzzed. It was David, his former colleague from the tech company. They'd stayed loosely in touch. David was now a VP of engineering at 32 years old. By all traditional measures, David had won the race that Marcus had dropped out of. The tech said, "Hey man, can we grab coffee? I need to talk to someone about something." They met that weekend at a cafe downtown. David looked successful in all the ways Marcus used to want to look. Expensive watch, tailored clothes, the subtle confidence of someone who had climbed high. But when Marcus looked closer, he saw something familiar in David's eyes. The same exhaustion he remembered from his own reflection 4 years ago. David ordered an espresso and got straight to it. "I've been thinking about quitting, and everyone says I'm crazy. I'm finally making real money. I'm young. I should be grateful. But Marcus, I wake up every day and feel like I'm suffocating." Marcus listened. He didn't immediately jump in with advice. He just let David talk. And as David spoke, Marcus heard his own story being told back to him with different details but the same underlying truth. David was a plum tree trying to bloom like a cherry. He was running someone else's race. He was living in the wrong season. When David finished, he looked at Marcus with desperate eyes. "How did you know? How did you know it was time to leave?" Marcus thought about this carefully. He didn't want to tell David what to do. That would just be replacing one external voice with another. Instead, he told David about Oubaitori, about the 4 trees that bloom differently. About his own journey from comparison to acceptance, about learning to trust his own timeline. David listened with the intensity of someone who's been waiting their whole life to hear these words. And when Marcus finished, David said something that made Marcus realize why this conversation was happening. "I've been watching you these last few years, on LinkedIn through mutual friends, and everyone was saying you'd made a mistake, taken a step backward, wasted your potential. But every time I saw you, you looked more alive than anyone I knew, and I couldn't figure out why. Now, I know. You stopped running my race, you started running yours." 6 months later, David quit his VP job. He didn't join a non-profit like Marcus. He did something completely different. He went back to school to become a teacher. Something he'd wanted to do since high school but had been told wasn't ambitious enough, didn't pay enough, was a waste of his potential. Marcus and David stayed in touch, and watching David's transformation was like watching his own journey replayed with different specifics, but the same underlying arc. From external validation to internal truth. From comparison to authenticity. From someone else's season to his own blooming time. A University of Pennsylvania researcher who's been studying life satisfaction across different age groups discovered something profound. The people who report the highest levels of fulfillment aren't those who achieved their goals the fastest or climbed the highest. They're the people who learned to define success on their own terms, who stopped comparing their timeline to others. Who accepted that their path would look different and that different wasn't wrong. This is the essence of Oubaitori. Not just accepting that people bloom at different times, but celebrating it, honouring it, building your entire life around the truth that your timing is your timing and no one else's opinion about it matters. 5 years after Marcus first learned about Oubaitori, his life looked nothing like he'd imagined it would at 33. He wasn't a millionaire. He didn't have a prestigious title at a famous company. He wasn't married with kids like many of his high school friends. His apartment was modest. His car was old, his savings account wasn't impressive, but he had something more valuable than any of those external markers. He had a life that felt like his own, work that mattered to him, relationships built on authenticity rather than image, a quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, and most importantly, he had freed himself from the most toxic form of violence there is. The violence of measuring your spring by someone else's summer, the violence of hating yourself for blooming at the wrong time, the violence of comparison. Marcus thought often about those 4 trees, the cherry, the plum, the peach, the apricot. How each one is perfect in its season, how each one contributes its own unique beauty to the world, how the forest would be so much less interesting if every tree tried to be a cherry. He realised that human society had forgotten this truth. We've created a monoculture where everyone is supposed to bloom at the same time, in the same way, toward the same definition of success. Graduate at 22, start your career immediately, get married by 28, buy a house by 30, have kids by 32, retire at 65. But humans aren't meant to be a monoculture any more than trees are. Some people bloom early, some bloom late, some bloom multiple times. Some have seasons of growth that look like nothing is happening, but underground their roots are going deep. And every single one of these patterns is natural and right and perfect. Marcus had become an evangelist for this truth, not in a preachy way, but in the way he lived his life, in the way he talked to the kids at the non-profit, in the way he responded when old friends asked if he regretted his choices. One of his favourite moments was when Jerome, now 19 and running his small but growing tech business, introduced Marcus to a new mentee. "This is Mr. Chen. He taught me that it's okay to not be like everyone else." And Marcus smiled because that wasn't quite right. He hadn't taught Jerome that it was okay to be different. He'd taught Jerome something more fundamental. That different is the only thing you can be. You can't be anyone else, no matter how hard you try. You can only be yourself, blooming in your own perfect season. The question isn't whether you should be like everyone else. The question is whether you have the courage to be like yourself. Now let me tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. You already know all of this. Deep down, underneath all the conditioning and expectations and fear, you already know that comparison is poison. You already know that you're on your own timeline. You already know that trying to be someone else is exhausting and impossible. The problem isn't knowledge. The problem is permission. You're waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to stop running the race everyone else seems to be winning. You're waiting for permission to bloom in your own season. So here it is. Permission granted, not from me, I'm just some voice in a video, but from the truth itself, from the way nature works, from the simple observable fact that every living thing has its own timing, and forcing it to bloom faster doesn't create more beauty, it creates deformity. You are not behind. The cherry tree in February isn't behind the plum tree that bloomed in January. It's simply preparing for March. Your March is coming. Or maybe you're a summer bloomer and your July is approaching. Or maybe you're one of those trees that blooms in fall when everyone else is losing their leaves and your October will be glorious. But wherever you are, whatever season you're in, you're exactly where you need to be. Not where you want to be, not where society says you should be, but where you need to be to become who you're meant to become. The people who seem ahead of you, they're just on a different path. The people who seem behind you, same thing. There is no ahead or behind because there's no single finish line we're all racing toward. There are 7 billion paths and 7 billion definitions of success, and 7 billion timelines, and every single one is valid. Marcus learned this, David learned this, Jerome learned this, and thousands of others are learning it right now. The question is, when will you? A therapist who has been working with high achievers for 25 years says that the most common source of suffering among successful people isn't failure. It's the gap between external success and internal emptiness. They climbed the mountain everyone told them to climb. They got to the top, and they realised it was the wrong mountain. Don't waste your life climbing the wrong mountain. Don't spend 40 years becoming really good at being someone you're not. Don't wake up at 50 and realise you've been running someone else's race. Start now, today, this moment. Ask yourself the questions Marcus learned to ask. Whose expectations am I living up to? Whose definition of success am I chasing? Whose timeline am I measuring myself against? And most importantly, if I let go of all that external noise, what does my own voice say? Your own voice might be quiet at first. You might have to listen very carefully to hear it underneath all the louder voices telling you what you should do, who you should be, when you should have it all figured out. But it's there. It's always been there, waiting for you to stop listening to everyone else long enough to hear it. And when you finally hear it, when you finally start following your own internal compass instead of everyone else's external expectations, something miraculous happens. You stop feeling like you're constantly losing. You stop comparing your chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. You stop running a race that was never meant for you. You start blooming, in your own time, in your own way, as your own type of tree. And the beautiful thing, the world needs your particular blossoms. The world doesn't need another cherry tree, it has plenty of cherry trees. What it needs is you. The peach tree, the plum tree, the apricot tree, whatever you are, blooming exactly as you're meant to bloom. This isn't some abstract philosophy. This is your life, right now, today. You can continue comparing yourself to everyone around you. feeling like you're constantly falling short, chasing goals that aren't even yours. Or you can do what Marcus did, what David did, what Jerome did. You can stop running someone else's race and start walking your own path. It won't be easy. Your family might not understand. Your friends might think you're making a mistake. Society will definitely have opinions, but none of those people have to live your life. You do, and at the end, the only opinion that will matter is yours. Did you bloom in your own season? Did you become what you were meant to become? Did you have the courage to be yourself in a world that was constantly trying to make you someone else? These are the only questions that matter. Everything else is noise. Marcus is 35 now, 7 years into his journey of Oubaitori, and if you asked him what he's learned, he'd tell you this. The greatest tragedy isn't failing. The greatest tragedy is succeeding at becoming someone you were never meant to be. Don't let that be your tragedy. Don't let comparison steal your one precious life. Don't spend another day measuring your spring by someone else's summer. You are your own tree, you have your own season, your own timing, your own perfect way of blooming. Honour that, protect that, live that. And when you do, when you finally stop running others' races and focus on your own unique path, you'll discover something that Marcus discovered. Something that changed everything. You'll discover that you've been enough all along. Not enough by society's standards, not enough by comparison to others, but enough by the only standard that truly matters, the standard of being authentically yourself. That's Oubaitori. That's the truth. That's the path. The only question left is whether you'll walk it. If this video resonated with you, if it touched something true, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. More importantly, I invite you to share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been comparing themselves, feeling behind, running someone else's race. Send them this video. It might be exactly what they need at exactly the right moment. And remember, you're not watching this by accident. You needed to hear this message today. Your season is coming. Or maybe it's already here and you just haven't recognized it yet. Either way, stop comparing, start blooming, be present, walk with honor, follow your own path until the next video.